All right, Psalm chapter 15, let's call this week's set of lessons. Actually, let's go back to the theme we started with in the book of Psalms and call this one way, meaning there are times in life when we want it to function one way when it really functions another, and maturity is making the adjustment. And so let's look at this week's set of lessons through the lens of wanting to inherit one way when we really inherit another, understanding that in chapter 16, that term inheritance is going to literally come up. But in chapter 15, we'll look at it through the lens of, okay, who actually will dwell with the Lord in peace? As it starts off in verse 1, O Lord, who shall sojourn in your tent? Who shall dwell on your holy hill? And it's going to seem to answer that question from the perspective of do's and don'ts, approximately 12 to be exact, broken up into two groups. The first group of 3 do's and 3 don'ts approximately seem to have to do with the way that we treat those close to us. And then the second set of 3 do's and roughly 3 don'ts seem to have more to do with the way that we treat people in general. But starting off with that first set of 3 do's, it will say in verse 2, he who walks blamelessly and does what is right and speaks truth in his heart. As far as the don'ts, who does not slander with his tongue, who does no evil to his neighbor, relatively close relationship, nor takes up a reproach against his friend. Understanding that we said those first 3 might have to do more with our closer relationships, understanding even further that we don't often use the term reproach, or at least I don't in my everyday language, but it may be more simply known as not taking a relationship in which you get to know personal information about another person's weaknesses especially, and using that to publicly embarrass them, understanding that we all have vulnerabilities. It goes back to that principle of with the measure you use, it will be measured back to you. Or the way that Jesus said it in Matthew 7:12 is, so whatever you wish that others would do to you, do also to them, for this is the law and the prophets. Understanding that I don't think any of us want our vulnerabilities exposed publicly purely for the sake of embarrassing us. And so the reproach is not necessarily exposing a vulnerability for the sake of helping us get better. It seems to be using a vulnerability to actually harm a friend, as we go into the second set of do's and don'ts in verse 4, where it says, in whose eye a vile person is despised, but who honors those who fear the Lord, who swears to his own hurt, and that transitions into the set of don'ts, and does not change, who does not put out his money at interest and does not take a bribe against the innocent. And so ultimately, the first set of do's, the ones that we said may have to do more with our close personal relationships, seem to talk about consistency, thus our title, in the sense that they say you have to walk blamelessly and do what's right, external actions, but in your heart, you got to be honest. And so likewise with the don'ts, it's not enough to simply avoid taking up a reproach against a friend or to avoid slandering. You have to be consistent. You can't cook up any evil whatsoever against a neighbor. Once again, a close personal relationship, and see that as producing the kind of consistency that leads to genuine peace with God. And likewise with the second set of do's, the ones that seem to have more to do with the way that we treat people in general. We need to be consistent in the way that we treat people according to how they actually are. Meaning, if you see a vile person or someone who is just not a decent person in the way that they treat other people, treat them like a vile person, whether or not they can do something for you or not. And in contrast, if you see somebody who is walking in the fear of God, or as we would generally say, who just lives as a decent person, because God is calling us to a standard of integrity that says treat people with kindness and genuine respect. If you see somebody who does that, but they can't do a whole lot for you, don't show favoritism to the vile person just because they can hook you up, but treat the decent person as though they don't matter simply because they don't really have clout. Likewise, do show consistency in giving our word, as hard as it can be to honor our commitment sometimes. Definitely try not to be the kind of person who backs out on your word simply because it's convenient. As for the don'ts, in addition to not backing out on our word as a matter of convenience, even though the chapter actually seems like it's calling us to a higher standard, it is saying do not take advantage of those in financial needs, specifically talking about lending at interest. And even though Israel and our culture today have permissible standards for lending with interest. This seems to be talking about specifically circumstances in which Israelites were not to lend at interest to their brothers when they were in certain times of hardship or need. And likewise, even when we have the right to charge interest, it seems to be placing a higher value on those who realize times in which they can lend but don't need to charge interest because a person has a greater financial need than our need to turn a profit. And then finally, it's saying that we need consistency in our standards or our ethics, meaning that getting money does not compromise our ability to see truth when it says, do not take a bribe. And all of that really seems to point forward to the next chapter where it says, David considers God a source of refuge. And the cool thing about David is that he consistently seemed to seek out God as a refuge, both in the good times and the bad. But the thing that we all have in common with David is something called foxhole confessions. And those are those times when, whether you are a believer or not, or even as a believer, if you are closely following God or not, when you get in a tight, you are more likely to call on some sort of higher power, whether or not you believe in a God, because there are times in life that remind you that life is larger than you or me or our ability to get ourselves out of a bind. And so when we understand that there are times in life when we call on some higher power as a refuge, this chapter is reminding us that consistency says we can't inherit a genuinely peaceful relationship with God if we are calling on him as a refuge from our distresses, but we are serving as the source of distress to those around us.